Thank you, Brandon. My thoughts exactly. And good morning again to you. Welcome to church. I'm Pastor Eric.
Good morning.
And I know you're wondering the same thing I am. Is it really January? Is January the 28th and my app says it's supposed to be 78? How does that work? But I guess we'll take it, right? It's just the suffering we have to go through to live in this part of the world. So, well, good morning to you. I hope that you are well and that you had a good week away from home. And like I said earlier, welcome home as we gather together and worship this morning. We were literally away from home this week because we were in the desert, in the wilderness, wandering after our two granddaughters, because we were on grandparent duty this week. So we had an interesting week, kind of doing a lot of driving and chasing little ones around, which caused us both to wonder, how did we raise 4 of these guys? How did we ever do that? Wow. But we are back again, and we are ready, as Brandon just said, to continue to look at some of Jesus' parables. This is our 3rd week looking at the parables of Jesus. I talked through the Gospel of Mark a couple of years ago, and Mark's Gospel is not the one that has just a whole bunch of parables, though. So I decided this go around, it would be a good opportunity as we enter into and continue into 2024 to look at Jesus teaching through some of his incredible stories. I'm calling this stories of grace and truth because Jesus' stories that he creates are so much, they revolve so much around his grace that I want to spend the beginning of it just focusing on his grace, but they also reflect a lot about what it means to be people who have received grace and how it is we are to live in response to that. So especially as we get into Lent, we're going to shift gears and start looking at the parables that also carry with them great demands. We're going to look at a parable this morning. You don't have to be a church person. You didn't have to grow up in church to know this parable. This parable, pretty much everyone is familiar with, at least to one degree or another, because it's been the subject of plays, it's been the subject of movies, it's been the subject of artwork, and even the central word that is used to label it, prodigal, has entered into our everyday vocabulary. When Henri Nouwen, the late Catholic priest and spiritual writer who was traveling the world really busy, he was in France at one point, and this was when he encountered for the first time that famous Rembrandt picture, probably the most famous picture of the Prodigal Son, which is simply called The Return of the Prodigal. Maybe we can hit the lights just a little bit so you can see the picture, because he's doing a lot of light and darkness stuff. So Henri Nouwen was in Paris, or somewhere in France, and he happened upon the office of a friend of his, and the person shut her door, and they're hanging on the back of the door, literally just pinned up, tacked up on the back of the door, was a reproduction of this great painting, The Return of the Prodigal. Henri Nouwen was so stunned by the painting, even though it was just on a cheap piece of paper, that he felt like he was left breathless as he looked at this painting, as he watched and its depiction of the way the characters are lined up, the play of light and darkness, the browns and the reds and the beiges. But mostly he was riveted by the father in this picture, this portrait of this man who reaches out with these strong but gentle arms, bringing the prodigal into his lap. And there's the prodigal, one of his shoes missing. He's ragged, he's forlorn, he's torn up. There's a rip between the father's 2 hands. His clothes, if you look real close, they're just literally straps. They're just pieces of fabric. His head is bald. He even looks flea-bitten. as he reaches into his Father's embrace. And there off to the right, everyone pretty much agrees, is the elder brother who just kind of watches pensively as this scene is displayed before him. Henri Nouwen was so stricken by this in 1983 that when he went back to Harvard, where he was teaching at the time, he scoured everywhere to find this poster. Finally, he found the poster. Couldn't order it online in those days. And he tacked it also to his wall, hoping that maybe the day would come when he would have the privilege of seeing the picture in real life. But he figured it would never happen because in those days, Russia was the USSR and it's housed at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So he figured, I'll never be able to see this painting. 3 years later, 1986, some friends of his who had connections inside of the so-called Iron Curtains invited him to go to St. Petersburg with them. He snatched it up immediately, not so much thinking about them, but thinking about Rembrandt's painting. And so he got there and he was so excited and he went to the Hermitage and he stepped outside and he realized the line was like a mile long. He felt so deflated until he went back to where these people were staying and he said, this is my experience. They said, don't worry about it because we've got connections inside the Hermitage. So they knew someone who had worked in the touch-up, the reproduction office. And so they got him in the next day. Henri Nouwen, that Catholic priest, had 3 hours alone with Rembrandt's gigantic painting. And there he sat, just swallowing it in, watching it as the light outside kind of changed, the way it shifted in the painting. He absorbed it. He stared at the Father's strong hands of embrace. And then that wasn't enough. He went back. He was exhausted, but he was also exhilarated. The next day, he had another hour with this majestic painting. And there, he just swallowed it in, feeling what it's like to go home to the Father's embrace. And that is to say nothing of the story itself. Because the story itself is an ingenious one that most of us know, at least, about a son who rebels, and then he comes to his senses, as Jesus says, and then he returns to his Father. Only I'm going to suggest to you this morning that it's not so simply a story about a son who rebels, comes to his senses, and then returns to his Father. That's the common conception, but there's a lot more to it than that. So it's high time that we revisit Luke chapter 15, the parable of the prodigal son, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. It's a longer story. It's one of the longest of Jesus' parables. It is rich. It is full of meaning, but I am going to read it for us, but don't worry that you're not going to fall asleep because it's a great story. And it's here on the wall in case you want to follow along. Luke chapter 15. Jesus has been telling parables, so we begin. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, The older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, so he called one of his servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed a fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But with this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Join me as we pray. You are the good Father, the compassionate, embracing one. We recognize this morning that as your word portrays you, just as high as the heavens are above the earth, your steadfast love for us is great. As far as the east is from the west, you remove our transgressions from us. And as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion on those who come before him. So we come before you this morning, welcoming your embrace, coming back home into your presence, sitting there and enjoying your embrace as we open your word and we hear your voice. May we know what it means, even viscerally, to be welcomed home by a compassionate and gracious Father, even this morning. For we pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus, the picture of perfect compassion. Amen. So as it stands, the story in Luke chapter 15 is not a complicated story. The plot really isn't that complex. The characters, I think, are pretty obvious. There's not that many of them, but the emotion is raw. Nevertheless, the ideas that people have had about what this parable means is kind of like non-stop, never-ending. Some people think it's a psychodrama. The Freudians have even gotten a hold of this parable. Some think it's a parable of Israel, as Israel wanders away and then Israel returns again. Some people think that it's about a person who leaves Jesus, disbelieves, and then comes back again. But the fact is, we can't unpack this famous analogy without looking at its context. That's always true, right? You've got to know the context before you understand what the thing means. And this parable does emerge out of a context. In fact, it's the third in a series of parables. So Luke chapter 15 begins by setting the stage for us, right? Here's the context. In Luke chapter 15, we begin verses 1 and 2 by reading this. "Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But then the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So the whole setting here shows Jesus, just like last week, fellowshipping with people that no one in that world would have fellowshipped with, hanging out with people that everyone would have dismissed as people like prostitutes and pickpockets and lowlifes and half-breeds and people like that were despised. But in the process, he's explaining himself to these self-righteous religious leaders, like the guys we saw last week in Luke chapter 7. He's explaining themselves to them now in a series of stories. instead of just answering them straightforward, he gives them this series of parables. And out of that, there emerges the third parable, which is our concern this morning. But you can't really grasp it until you at least familiarize yourself with the first two parables. So real quickly, let's go to the first parable. Just real quickly. The first parable, Jesus says, in response to these religious teachers who are disgusted with his hanging out with these kinds of people, is about a shepherd who has 100 sheep. So he's got a whole bunch of these sheep, way more than most people had. He loses one of them, but he leaves 99 of them, and he goes out in search of the lost one. Then when he finds the lost one, he brings out all of his friends, and they rejoice because the lost has been found. Clearly what Jesus is saying here is that the lost sheep in the story represents the sinner that Jesus is hanging out with. That's clearly the point. He goes on with this second parable. It's almost the same thing. It's just that the characters change. Now we have a woman who has 10 precious silver coins. This is everything she owns. Suddenly she loses one of them. So she loses 1/10 of all of her investments, really. She loses one of them. And so she goes out looking for it all through the house. She sweeps in every corner. She brings her friends in, and they also join her in finding it. When finally they find the coin, what do? They rejoice and celebrate. Again, clearly the lost coin is the sinner Jesus is friends with. Only after those first two does Jesus tell the story of a prodigal who returns to the embrace of his father. So you can't know the fullness of the story of the prodigal son without understanding the first two parables, and you can't really grasp the meaning of the third parable without understanding that Jesus uses some key words in each one of the parables that highlight its meaning. So back to the first parable. Jesus repeats in each parable the word lost and rejoicing or joy, or some variation of that verb, and the word sinner. So notice in verse 6 in the first parable, a sheep was lost. But in verse 7, the shepherd was filled with joy, rejoicing because that sheep was a sinner who repented. Okay? You go to the second parable, same exact thing. You have a coin now that was lost, but when it was found, the people are rejoicing because the coin represents, verse 10, a sinner who repents. Same thing in the third parable. The prodigal now was lost, but verse 32, when he is found, a father is glad. The root word is the same word as the word for rejoicing, because now back to verse 21, a sinner has returned. So there's no question about it. The parables are about the lost who are sinners, who when they return, it results in great rejoicing. And all of these parables come in response to that simple question in verse 2. This man, it's not really a question, it's a statement. This man associates with sinners. But the third parable's a lot longer. And if the third parable is only supposed to be about a story of someone who is lost, who was a sinner, who is found, and there is great rejoicing, if that's all that the story is about, then why doesn't it end at verse 24? If that's all the story is about, why doesn't the story come to a conclusion after the lost son returns? That's our question. And so with that, we're going to jump into the so-called story of the prodigal son. The story begins with the now rather infamous prodigal. He is the younger of two sons, and he is the character out of the story that everyone remembers, right? Here he is. He is probably, we can use our imaginations since this is an imaginative story, he's probably a late-stage adolescent who decides to demand his portion of the inheritance. I have to make a number of cultural comments throughout this message this morning because the culture behind it is really important to really absorbing what is being said here. Culturally, to have a young man go to his father before he's married, et cetera, and demand that the father give him his share of the inheritance was at bare minimum not normal, totally unusual, very rare. Sons just didn't do that. The boy's request then was insensitive at best, and it was ruthless at worst. We can imagine this because our way of thinking, our way of going about things is really similar to the way things were for them. So here's the deal. The reason that you and I, when we get into our lives where we finally have a real job and we're working, the reason we invest, the reason we open an IRA or a 401k or a 403b or whatever they call these things, the reason you might buy precious metals and the other person might invest in properties, the reason we save up money and invest it is so that you can take care of yourself when your income producing years end, right? Inheritances are only calculated out based on what remains after the person dies. And all of my lawyers are nodding their heads, so I must be correct. But this is a guy who comes demanding of his father's means for his own making a living. It's really interesting that in verse 12, literally, Jesus says, the father divided to them the life. I mean, in the NIV, it says, he divided his property to them. Most translations put property, but literally, the word says, he divided to them his life because his estate was his means for maintaining his life. So when he acquiesces to this son's outrageous request, he pours out his very life for him. So at the very least, the prodigal is violating the great commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, which says, you shall honor your father and mother so that it will go well for you as you enter into the land you are inheriting. His actions show he doesn't care for his father. He doesn't desire a relationship with his father. And as one man wrote, he wanted the father's money, not the father. But he didn't care. He takes off to New Orleans instead. He goes to Las Vegas or wherever he goes, where he finds everything he imagines that he wants until he runs out of money to pay for what he at least imagines that he wants. And if that's not enough, a famine strikes, so he finds himself with no food. And then on top of that, he has no money to buy the food if there were food for him to buy. So he finds himself in a real pickle. So literally, in order to survive, he agrees to take care of some farmer's pigs. Cultural comment being inserted at this point. First of all, he's a Jew. We just presume that from the way of the story and the context. He's a Jew. He's gone to a distant land. So he's hanging out with Gentiles and now has given himself an employment to a Gentile. And on top of that, what's his job? To work with the most anathema of all the anathemized animals in the Old Testament. The one animal that everyone knows Jews cannot eat would be swine. But this man has lowered himself to such a level, he's so desperate that he hires himself out to a Gentile to take care of his swine. In fact, most Jews at that day would say, Jews shouldn't even touch pigs, but he's desperate. And so into the pigsty he jumps, hoping that they would share some of his slop. In recovery terms, this guy has hit rock bottom. Until verse 17. Good translation. He came to his senses. Realizing that his dad's servants eat better than he's eating with pigs, he flees back to his father. which brings us to character number 2. The second character is Dad, the father. But this guy is not your typical dad. His good-for-nothing youngest son comes to the father with no regard for him, no concern about his own livelihood, no concern about his dad's future. He demands his inheritance. But this dad gives the kid what he wants. But this is the kind of father who doesn't force himself on anyone, apparently. And by the way, let me remind you at this point, this parable is not a parable about good parenting, but that's another subject altogether. When the son demands his share, he goes to the safe, he gives him what he wants, and he tearfully lets him go. And there he goes back to his own home and he waits longingly. Months later, we might imagine he's outside working in his vineyard or something, and he looks out on that winding road that leads up to his home, and he sees dust being kicked up, and he notices someone coming from the distance. And then as the guy gets clear, he recognizes by his gait that it's his lost son. And so he throws all caution and all custom to the wind, and he pulls up his tunic and he runs to his son. You may have heard this because it's true. It was completely out of order, completely inappropriate in that culture for a man of any dignity to run, because he would have had to pull up his tunic and expose his legs, and no self-respecting older man in that culture would have ever exposed his own legs. But he does. He runs out with abandon to greet his son. And what a welcome it was. Put on the robe, get out the ring, and take out the fattened calf. It's time to celebrate. Verse 24. So the son of mine was dead. Am I on the right screen? But now he is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This, by the way, is what so captivated Henri Nouwen in this painting. It was the emotional embrace of the father. Henri Nouwen had spent the last year of his life traveling all around the world. He'd been speaking here and speaking there, and in between he would be writing, and then he would stay with strange people here and strange people there, and he just felt lost. He wasn't really lost. He wasn't really isolated from God the Father, but he just kind of felt that longing. And so this painting just grabbed him where he was at. In fact, in his own words, for Nouwen, he says, this meant walking step by step toward the one who awaits me with open arms and wants to hold me in an eternal embrace. Side note here, maybe that's all you need to hear this morning. Maybe you recognize this morning you are a child of the Father and you belong with your Father. And you need to hear this morning that your Father awaits you with open arms. You see, there is a sense in this parable in which we are supposed to identify with the prodigal. There's supposed to be something in everyone's heart that identifies with this feeling of being isolated. When we recognize inside each one of us our own bankruptcy, our own sinfulness, our own estrangement. In fact, interestingly, Rembrandt did not just paint one painting of the prodigal son. He painted more than one. One of them hangs at a museum in Dresden, and it is called The Prodigal in the Brothel. And here is a depiction of the prodigal in all of his wantonness and his forlorn partying away from his father. There he is having this great party. He's holding up this great big glass of ale, I suppose. And down on his hip, you can't really see it, is a sword. And there on his lap is the woman of ill repute. But when you look at it more closely, if you're familiar with Rembrandt's work, that's a self-portrait of Rembrandt. Rembrandt painted himself all the time. That is Rembrandt. He's looking back at the viewer to reveal that he is the prodigal. In fact, when you look more closely, scholars know the girl's face is the painting of his girlfriend, Saskia. It's a self-portrait. Rembrandt saw himself in the story of the prodigal. And if you're here this morning and you see yourself in the story of the prodigal, I suggest to you, though, your eyes should not be fixed on the prodigal, but your eyes should be fixed on the image of the Father. He shows you that there's a party waiting for your return. He shows you that the Father throws dignity to the wind and rushes towards prodigals with a wild embrace and open arms and slobbery kisses. This Father, our Father, is driven by compassion even for you. So Klein Snodgrass wrote, this chapter is the most forceful description that exists of God seeking sinners and reveling in their return. But let's admit it, the most interesting character, maybe the most compelling character, certainly the most unique character here is the elder son. That haunting figure standing off to the right, kind of in the shadows, looking down, kind of, restrained, pensive, observing his wheels spinning. Because I remind you, this story is different than the parables that come before it simply because this must not be making the same simple point, the lost has been found, rejoice, hallelujah, go home. Were it not for the elder son in this last story, that's all this would mean. But the entrance of the elder son, stage left, changes everything. Think about this guy. He doesn't get it. The father's acting like a fool, and the elder brother is standing there, and he's sickened by it. He just can't understand why the whole household should be turned upside down. He doesn't understand why there is celebrating. Why is there singing? Why is somebody playing the fiddle? Why is there a party going on? Why are people dancing? Just because this pleased that irresponsible scamp of a brother of mine to come back home when he faced no other option? We're going to celebrate that? In fact, to the elder, the brother of his isn't a brother at all. Interestingly, in verse 30, he refers to him as that son of yours. And notice the contrast between the father and the elder son. The father is rejoicing, but he is angry. Verse 28, a word that means wrathful. The father is driven by compassion, clearly in verse 20, but the elder son is driven by resentment. The father is celebrating, he is brooding. The father is embracing, he is judging. But when you think about it, he does have a good point. Let's be honest. He's the good kid. He's not the type to star in an epic narrative like this. He's not the type to live dangerously. He has consistently, all through his life, played it safe. He never ran away. He never returned to find the father's tear-filled eyes waiting for him. He is not the kind of kid who can sing, I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. His testimony is just, frankly, it's boring. You see, he's never experienced what it's like to have all of his burdens lifted and his IOUs canceled. He's never experienced what it's like to be forgiven carte blanche after a self-serving foray into the seedy underworld. In the elder brother's mind, he's never been lost because he never left. So to him, the younger brother's story is just a miserable sinner's capitulation to his desperate plight. He's painted himself into a corner. He has no other option but to come running back to dad with his tail between his legs. And it only goes downhill from there. This kid's thinking, for that matter, nobody ever got excited about me. Nobody had to bother to come looking for me because I never left to begin with. So you come to verse 29, and it's the pinnacle of his thinking. He answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. So in his righteous anger, he refuses to celebrate. Nothing to do with it. And yes, I feel for him too. If you're the good kid who never turned and ran off, you may feel for the elder brother more than you do for the prodigal. But on the other hand, isn't there something heinous about this guy? If the elder son is so privileged and he's so close to his father, then why isn't he rejoicing too? Why doesn't his heart hurt with his father as his brother has taken off into profligate living? Why doesn't he then rejoice when his father returns? In fact, another cultural comment, by his not going to the banquet, he has also shamed his father. And he has also broken the commandment to honor your father and your mother. The elder brother has grown up and he still lives in the atmosphere and in the protection of his father. But the fact that he loves his father and the father loves him is taken so much for granted that he doesn't even think about it. So the physical proximity of the elder brother to his father actually disguises a profound estrangement of heart. This is a guy who's lost his first love. This is a guy whose heart is no better than his younger brother's, only you don't notice it because he didn't physically run away from home. So it created this kind of illusion of oneness with his father. But the truth is, the younger brother isn't the only one who is lost. And so we call this the parable of the prodigal son, but other people have suggested, no, this is the parable of two lost sons. I think that the entrance of the elder brother on stage left brings us into the heart of what Jesus is trying to say in the parable of the prodigal son. It does. It reinforces the same thing in the first parable. It reinforces the same thing the second parable does. But the third parable brings out a new angle. Plainly, Snodgrass underscores the purpose of the analogy is to contrast the father's attitude of celebration with the elder son's disdain. So the elder brother commands us as we read this story to wake up and ask ourselves the question, am I more like the prodigal son or am I more like the elder brother? And so the elder brother compels us to do some serious soul searching. Two things this morning. First of all, the elder brother compels me to compare my heart with the father's heart. The elder brother is inserted into the story to compel us to compare our heart with the father's heart. Because the whole thing is an issue of the heart. Ultimately, the younger brother and the older brother are the same. Both of their hearts have drifted from the heart of the father. It's just that one physically acts it out and the other does not. It's always a great question to ask. It's always a great question to ask ourselves, how is our heart like the Father's heart? How is my heart like or unlike the heart of the Father? This is a critical question to ask, whether you fled like a prodigal or you never left the Father's company. Your heart can be detached from God even when it doesn't look like it on the outside. And like the older brother, a key way to check on your own heart's condition is to see how it stands between you and the lost. A key way to know how your heart relates to the Father's heart is by looking at how it is you relate to people who have not come back to the Father, those who are estranged. It's when we answer questions like, do I welcome the lost? Or do I even resent them? Do I rejoice embracing the return of the lost just like the Father does? Or am I indifferent to them? The late German theologian Helmut Thielicke made a great statement. I put it up here, and it's also in your life group homework. He wrote, a person who cannot wholeheartedly rejoice with God when the icy crust about a torpid, empty heart begins to thaw, a person who is not himself inflamed by the glowing love of Jesus for the erring and the lost and is not impelled to rescue human souls, that person is alienating himself from God in a very subtle but dreadful way. No matter how consciously and determinedly he continues to dwell with him, even though he prays and reads the Bible and goes to church. To never leave the Father's side is something to be celebrated, but the secret here is that the elder brother actually has left the Father's side. He's obedient and he is good on the outside, but he is miserably out of tune with the Father's heart on the inside. So secondly, I suggest that the elder brother compels me to adopt the Father's heart for the lost. And we need look no further than the Father's unique and only Son, Jesus Christ. He's the one who's the picture of God's heart for the lost. Compassionate, embracing, rejoicing, just as he is at the beginning of this chapter. And yet, he's always in trouble because he welcomes sinners and eats with them. But that's obviously the heart of God. Psalm 103 is a reflection on God's great self-revelation in Exodus chapter 34. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion on his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. No wonder Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of God's very being, no wonder Jesus perfectly reflected his Father's heart and hung out with tax collectors and sinners. Back to last week. Are we guilty of the same thing? Could we be charged by those religious elites with the same kind of thing? Or is your hive buzzing with Christians only? They've actually done statistical research on this. They do statistical research on everything else, so why not this? They've done statistical research on this. When a person comes to Christ, when a person becomes a Christian, they statistically have hordes of non-Christian friends, right? Those that the Bible calls lost, not pejoratively, but that's just what the Bible calls people who are lost, right? They haven't returned to the Father. So when you first come to Christ, you have hordes of friends who are not believers. But statistically, they show that after a certain period of time, that number goes doop, 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 down to zero. where eventually most Christians have no relationships with people, at least of any substance, with people outside of the Christian faith. This is where we need to watch out, because over time, even a former prodigal can turn into the older brother. Brooding, resentful, judging. Some of us need to imitate Jesus by cultivating relationships with those who need the Father. So are our homes open to the lost? Are our lives open to the lost? Is our church open to the lost? So anyway, here's the proverbial bottom line. The closer you draw to the Father's heart, the closer your heart will begin to beat like his, right? This is the bottom line of everything. The closer your heart can draw to the Father's heart, the more in time your heart will begin to beat like his. And so I'll leave you with this. First of all, come to the Father and practice listening. Come to the Father and practice listening. Stop always talking when you're in the Father's presence, and just listen by meditating and reflecting on his word. Just listen. 2, come to the Father and practice asking. After you've just been silent and just listened, now ask, but ask for this. Ask him to make your heart like his. 3rd, come to the Father and practice confession. This is what we talked about last week. Because confession serves to remind us of our own need for forgiveness and his unstoppable grace, even for me. And when we put ourselves in that position, we're more likely to sympathize with those who are lost and remember ourselves what it's like to be lost. 4th, come to the Father and practice thanksgiving. Practice thanksgiving. Again, Tilika wrote, the marvel of God's gracious act upon our life never really dawns upon us unless we render thanks to him every day. Just like confession. The more thankful you are to him for his grace, the more you realize that you are dependent on his grace, and all of these people around us need that grace too. And finally, practice doing. Even if your heart's not quite there, step out there and reach out to the lost anyone and watch the Father go to work in changing your heart to making it like his. Because the fact is, the more time you spend with God the Father, the more you are going to become like God the Father. So come to the Father and go to the lost. So our Father, we come to you this morning and we recognize fully, transparently, and openly that our hearts, even the best among us, are just at a distance from your own hearts, your own heart. We confess to you that even those of us who are convinced that what we've learned this morning is true and that this is our cry also, we're still imperfect when it comes to reaching out with your grace to people who so desperately need you. So this morning we begin by asking you to change our hearts. We begin this journey afresh and anew in the call that you've given to us individually and as a church to love God, to follow Jesus, and to serve other people by reaching out to people who don't know you but need your loving embrace. So change our hearts.